The mountains had a way of convincing the universe to leave you alone. At least that was what Thomas believed when he bought the cabin 10 years ago. It sat halfway up a narrow ridge surrounded by tall pine trees and stubborn rocks that looked like they had been arguing with gravity for centuries. No cities, no traffic, no loud orbital cargo supervisors yelling through comm links about delayed shipments. Just wind, snow, and the occasional confused delivery drone that had taken a wrong navigation route. Thomas liked that kind of quiet. The cabin itself was simple but sturdy. A small solar array clung to the roof like metallic moss, quietly storing energy during the day. Inside, an aging heater hummed patiently, the sort of machine that sounded like it was always telling an old story. The walls were decorated with mismatched shelves filled with tools, spare circuits, and a few strange souvenirs from Thomas's former life, repairing cargo ships in orbit. Life in the mountains followed a comfortable routine. Wake up, check the solar panels, drink coffee that tasted slightly like burnt metal, and occasionally argue with the weather. It was peaceful, which was exactly why Thomas noticed immediately when something unusual happened. It started as a faint streak of light across the sky. Thomas stepped outside with a bundle of firewood balanced on his shoulder. The night was cold and clear, the stars scattered across the sky like someone had spilled glowing sand over a black table. Normally, he enjoyed moments like this. Tonight, however, one of those glowing points was moving very fast. He squinted. "Huh," he muttered. The streak brightened as it tore through the atmosphere, trailing sparks like a meteor. But Thomas had seen enough spacecraft in his life to recognize the difference between a rock and something with an engine. That definitely was not a rock. The object vanished behind the distant tree line with a muted thump that vibrated faintly through the ground. Birds scattered from the forest in alarm. Thomas sighed slowly and set the firewood down. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "that's probably nothing." He waited a moment. The forest remained quiet. Thomas nodded to himself with great confidence. "Yes," he continued, "absolutely nothing. Just a completely normal glowing thing falling out of space near my house." He lasted about 30 seconds before curiosity defeated him. Grabbing a flashlight and a thermal scanner, leftover equipment from his cargo repair days, Thomas began walking toward the impact site. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he pushed through the trees. The scanner beeped softly. Heat signature detected. "Great," Thomas murmured. "It's either a broken shuttle or a very angry alien." The forest opened into a small clearing, and the flashlight beam swept across the snow. That was when he saw her. A woman lay partially buried in the snow beside a jagged piece of metallic debris. The armor she wore was unlike anything Thomas had seen in civilian space. Smooth plates of dark alloy covered her arms and shoulders, etched with faint glowing symbols that flickered like tired stars. Her long hair had fallen across her face, and her ears, Thomas leaned closer. They were long and slightly pointed, elegant and unmistakably alien. "Well," he said slowly, rubbing the back of his neck, "that answers the alien question." She was unconscious, breathing faintly but steadily. A thin crack ran through one of the armor plates near her shoulder, and dried blood marked the fabric beneath it. Thomas crouched beside her, examining the armor with a mechanic's curiosity. "Military design," he muttered. "Expensive, too." He looked up at the sky. "Listen," he told the empty mountains, "I moved out here specifically to avoid situations like this." The mountains offered no response. The woman shifted slightly, barely conscious, a quiet sound escaping her lips. Thomas sighed again. "Well," he said, "I suppose leaving you here would be rude." He carefully lifted her. Despite the armor, she was lighter than he expected. Her head rested briefly against his shoulder as he carried her through the forest. Snow continued to fall gently through the trees. Thomas walked slowly toward the cabin, muttering to himself the entire way. "You know what this means, right?" he said. "This means paperwork. Somewhere out there, someone is going to want forms filled out." He glanced down at the unconscious alien woman. "And somehow," he added, "I'm already certain this is going to become my problem." The woman did not wake up the first night. Thomas laid her carefully on the small bed in the cabin's only spare room, which had previously been used to store broken tools, old blankets, and a mysterious box labeled, "Do not touch, possibly explosive." The box had been moved outside immediately. Priorities were important. The alien woman remained still, her breathing steady but shallow. The strange armor she wore made a faint humming sound, as if tiny machines inside it were arguing quietly about how to fix the damage. Thomas stood beside the bed, arms folded, studying her. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "this is definitely the strangest thing that has happened here since the raccoon tried to steal my solar battery." She didn't respond, which he considered slightly rude but understandable. He dragged a chair next to the bed and sat down with a small medical scanner he had kept from his orbital repair days. The scanner was old but reliable, like a grumpy doctor who had seen too many accidents. The device beeped as he passed it over her armor. "Internal injuries. Moderate," he murmured. "Energy burns. Minor. Stress levels." The scanner made a concerned noise. "Very high," Thomas said. "Yeah, I can relate to that." Removing the armor was difficult. The material was clearly designed for combat environments, and the locking seams resisted his attempts to open them. After several minutes of careful work and one short conversation, where Thomas politely asked the armor to cooperate, the plates finally loosened. Underneath, she wore a thin black underlayer embedded with faint glowing threads, medical nanofibers slowly repairing damaged tissue. "Fancy," Thomas muttered. Her long ears were more visible now, slightly curved and elegant. They gave her an otherworldly appearance, though her face looked almost human otherwise. Her expression, even while unconscious, carried a kind of tension that suggested she was used to danger. Thomas leaned back in his chair. "All right," he said. "Let's review the situation." He raised a finger. "Point 1. Mysterious alien woman crashes near my house." Another finger. "Point 2. Extremely expensive armor." Another. "Point 3. Definitely not a tourist." He sighed. "Point 4. I am absolutely not getting paid for this." The heater hummed quietly in the background, clearly uninterested in the conversation. Thomas stood and walked to the small kitchen. He brewed coffee using his ancient machine, which whistled like a confused kettle before producing a cup of dark liquid that smelled vaguely like burned wiring. He took a sip and winced. "Perfect," he said. "Exactly as terrible as usual." When he returned to the room, the woman had moved slightly. Her fingers twitched. Thomas froze mid-step. "Ah," he said slowly. "Progress." Her breathing changed, becoming deeper, more controlled. The small medical fibers beneath her clothing pulsed softly, finishing their repairs. Then suddenly her eyes opened. She sat up in one swift motion. The movement was so fast that Thomas nearly dropped his coffee. The woman scanned the room instantly. Door, windows, corners, ceiling. Her gaze moved like a trained soldier analyzing a battlefield. Then her eyes stopped on Thomas. Silence filled the room. Thomas lifted his coffee cup in a polite gesture. "Good evening," he said. "Or morning, I'm not entirely sure. You were unconscious for about 2 days." She stared at him. Her eyes were sharp, alert, calculating. Thomas pointed at himself. "My name is Thomas. I live here. Normally alone." Her gaze moved toward the window briefly, measuring distance and terrain through the glass. Even while sitting in bed, her posture was ready for action. "Where am I?" she asked. Her voice was calm but carried the weight of command. "Mountains," Thomas replied. "Planet Earth. Specifically the quiet part where nothing interesting is supposed to happen." She studied him carefully. Thomas gestured toward the door. "You crashed nearby," he added. "Technically in my forest, which means you owe the trees an apology." For a moment, the alien woman looked confused. Then unexpectedly, a small breath of laughter escaped her. It was quiet, almost unfamiliar to her. "My name," she said after a moment, "is Shayla." Thomas nodded. "Well, Shayla," he said, taking another sip of terrible coffee, "I'm glad you're awake, because carrying armored aliens through the snow is not something I want to make a habit of." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You carried me?" "Yes." She glanced down at her armor pieces resting nearby. "You removed my combat plates." Thomas shrugged. "They looked uncomfortable." She looked back at him, clearly trying to decide whether he was extremely brave or extremely foolish. Thomas scratched his head. "For the record," he added, "if you're a dangerous criminal, I would prefer to know now." Shayla tilted her head slightly. "And if I am?" she asked. Thomas thought for a moment. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose I'd still offer you soup." She blinked. Why? Thomas smiled slightly. Because if someone is going to cause problems in my peaceful mountain life, he said, they might as well do it on a full stomach. Morning in the mountains arrived quietly, like a careful guest who did not want to disturb anyone. Pale sunlight filtered through the tall pine trees and slipped between the wooden shutters of the cabin. The heater hummed softly, the same steady sound it had made every morning for years. Thomas was already awake. He sat at the small kitchen table staring at a frying pan with deep suspicion. Inside it, several eggs were attempting to become breakfast. Cooking had never been his strongest skill. During his years working on orbital cargo stations, most of his meals had come from vending machines that proudly claimed their food was technically edible. The eggs in the pan made a small sizzling sound. Thomas squinted at them. All right, he muttered, pointing a spatula at the pan. Let's all stay calm. Behind him, the floorboards creaked. Thomas turned his head slowly. Shayla stood in the doorway. She looked fully awake now. The exhaustion that had weighed on her before had faded slightly, replaced by the alert stillness of someone who had survived many dangerous situations. Her long ears were clearly visible in the morning light, rising slightly through her dark hair. She studied the room again, but this time her movements were slower, less tense. Then she looked at the frying pan. Thomas raised a finger. Before you say anything, he said, this is a delicate scientific process. Shayla tilted her head. The eggs appear to be losing, she replied. Thomas glanced back at the pan. The eggs had burned. He sighed. Yes, he admitted. They do that sometimes. Shayla stepped into the kitchen and sat down at the table. Her movements were careful but strong, like someone whose body had already recovered, but whose mind was still deciding whether to trust the environment. Thomas scraped the burned eggs onto 2 plates. Breakfast, he announced proudly. Shayla stared at the plate. Then she looked up at him. Is this a punishment? She asked calmly. Thomas laughed. No, this is the improved version. She looked down again. There was a worse version. Several, Thomas said. We don't talk about those. For a moment, Shayla simply studied him. The quiet man in the mountain cabin seemed strangely relaxed for someone who had found an armored alien warrior in his forest 2 nights earlier. She picked up the fork cautiously and tasted the eggs. Her face remained completely neutral. Thomas leaned forward. Well? She swallowed slowly. I believe, she said carefully, that this meal could be used as a weapon. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Yes, I suspected that. Despite herself, Shayla smiled. It was small and brief, but it was real. Thomas poured 2 cups of coffee and pushed one across the table toward her. This one is less dangerous, he said. She lifted the cup and sniffed it. Her expression changed immediately. Actually, she said, this one may also be a weapon. Thomas shrugged. Consistency is important. Shayla took a small sip anyway. She did not react immediately, which Thomas considered impressive. The 2 of them sat quietly for a moment while the morning sunlight filled the room. Outside, wind moved gently through the trees. Finally, Shayla spoke again. You live here alone? She asked. Thomas nodded. Best decision I ever made. Why? He leaned back in his chair. Because space stations are loud, he said. Engines, alarms, supervisors yelling about maintenance schedules. Up here, the only thing that screams at me is the wind. Shayla looked out the window toward the mountains. For several seconds, she said nothing. Thomas noticed the change in her expression. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something deeper. Fatigue. Not physical fatigue. The kind that sleep could fix. Something older. You've been running for a while, haven't you? Thomas asked gently. Shayla looked back at him. Her eyes were sharp again. I did not say that. You didn't have to. She studied him. How would you know? Thomas took a sip of coffee and made a face. Because, he said, people who fall out of the sky wearing military armor are usually either chasing someone or being chased. Shayla remained silent. Thomas lifted the fork again and poked one of the burned eggs. Personally, he added, I'm hoping it's the second one. I'd feel bad if my guess turned out to be the terrifying one. Shayla leaned back in the chair slowly. And if I am? She asked. Thomas considered this. Well, he said, then I suppose the mountains will finally get some excitement. She stared at him for several seconds. Then she asked quietly, You are not afraid? Thomas shrugged. I was more afraid of the eggs. The answer caught her off guard. A quiet laugh escaped her again before she could stop it. For the first time since waking up, Shayla felt something unfamiliar. Not strategy, not survival. Peace. But far above the planet's atmosphere, invisible to both of them, distant scanners had already begun searching the mountain ranges, and they were getting closer. The mountain air that afternoon carried the sharp scent of pine and melting snow. Sunlight stretched across the clearing beside the cabin, reflecting off the solar panels on the roof. Thomas stood on a ladder with a wrench in one hand, adjusting a panel that had shifted slightly during the previous night's wind. Below him, Shayla watched. She had insisted on helping. Thomas had insisted that she rest. Shayla had ignored him. Now she stood in the clearing with her arms folded, studying the small structure of wires and panels like it was some kind of strange primitive technology. You built this? She asked. Thomas tightened a bolt and climbed down from the ladder. Mostly, he said. The original panel system came with the cabin, but the battery storage and regulators are mine. Shayla crouched beside a metal box connected to the system. This design is old, she said carefully. Thomas looked mildly offended. Thank you. I meant, she corrected, that it is efficient for something so simple. Better, Thomas said. She opened the battery housing and examined the circuitry inside. Tiny lights blinked steadily along the compact grid. In most places, she said, energy systems are fully automated. Thomas leaned against the ladder. Automation breaks, he said. Simple things just get grumpy. Shayla looked up. Grumpy? Yes, machines have personalities. She stared at him for a moment. That is not scientifically accurate. Thomas gestured toward the cabin. Tell that to my heater. It refuses to work unless I compliment it first. Shayla blinked. You compliment a machine? Of course. He raised a finger. Yesterday it was making a terrible rattling sound. And? I told it that it was a beautiful piece of engineering. Shayla waited. And it stopped rattling, Thomas finished. Silence filled the clearing. Then Shayla said calmly, that was probably because the vibration cycle stabilized. Thomas nodded. Yes, exactly what I said. Despite herself, Shayla smiled again. It felt strange. Her life had been filled with command centers, war rooms, and starship bridges. Every conversation had been about tactics, losses, and survival. No one had ever discussed complementing heaters. Thomas walked toward the woodshed and grabbed an axe. We need more firewood, he said. Shayla stood. I will help. Thomas handed her the axe. The moment it touched her hands, her entire posture changed. The relaxed calm vanished. Her movements became precise, balanced, efficient. She raised the axe once and brought it down. The log split perfectly. Thomas stared. Well, he said slowly, that was impressive. Shayla picked up another log. The second strike split it cleanly again. Then another, and another. Within a few minutes, half the woodpile had been cut. Thomas scratched his head. Okay, he said. Either you've done this before, or you've chopped a lot of enemies in half. Shayla paused. Both, she admitted quietly. Thomas whistled. That explains the technique. She continued working, but something in her expression had changed. The calm rhythm of the task seemed to relax her. For a while, neither of them spoke. Wind moved gently through the trees. Finally, Thomas asked, so where exactly did you learn to fight like that? Shayla drove the axe into another log. Many places. Military? Yes. Thomas nodded slowly. I had a feeling. She looked up. How? You stand like someone who expects explosions. That answer surprised her. Most people never notice such things. You were in the military too? She asked. Thomas shook his head. Nope, just a mechanic. She studied him again. You do not behave like a civilian. Thomas leaned against the woodpile. What does a civilian behave like? Careful, Shayla said. He thought about that. Then he shrugged. I'm bad at careful. Shayla returned the axe to the stump. You helped me without asking questions, she said. Yes. You brought a stranger into your home. Yes. You are either very kind or very foolish. Thomas considered the idea carefully. I prefer to think of it as extremely confident stupidity. For a moment, Shayla simply looked at him. Then she laughed again. The sound echoed softly through the quiet clearing. But as the laughter faded, her eyes drifted toward the sky. Far above the mountains, something moved. Too high to see clearly, but Shayla's expression grew serious. Thomas noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she watched the sky carefully. Then she said quietly, "The galaxy does not like it when people disappear." Thomas followed her gaze but saw only clouds. "Well," he said, "the galaxy will have to wait its turn." Shayla looked at him. "You do not understand." Thomas smiled slightly. "No," he admitted. Then he picked up another log and tossed it onto the chopping block. "But I'm starting to suspect that things around here are about to get interesting." That evening, the temperature dropped quickly, the kind of mountain cold that crept through the trees and quietly reminded everything alive that winter still had unfinished business. The cabin lights glowed softly against the dark forest, while inside the heater hummed with renewed enthusiasm after receiving several compliments from Thomas earlier in the day. "You're doing excellent work," he had told it very seriously. The heater responded by functioning perfectly. Shayla had watched this ritual with a level of concern usually reserved for unstable commanders. Now she sat at the small wooden table while Thomas stirred something inside a metal pot on the stove. The smell drifting through the room was complicated. It was not unpleasant, but it was also not entirely reassuring. Shayla leaned slightly toward the pot. "What is that?" Thomas lifted the spoon and examined the contents like a scientist observing an unpredictable experiment. "Soup." She narrowed her eyes. "What kind of soup?" Thomas hesitated. "Technically speaking," he said, "it started as vegetable soup." "Started?" "Well," he continued cautiously, "then I added several improvements." Shayla looked at the pot again. "It appears to be glowing." Thomas peered into the pot. "Only a little." A faint bluish shimmer moved through the surface of the soup. Shayla folded her arms. "You added something alien to the soup." Thomas pointed the spoon at her. "That is a strong accusation." She pointed toward the glowing surface. "It is glowing." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, but in a friendly way." She stared at him. "Food should not glow." He shrugged. "You say that, but half the things I ate on cargo stations could probably power small spacecraft." Shayla looked unconvinced. Thomas finally placed 2 bowls on the table and poured the glowing soup into them. Steam rose slowly. The glow remained. Shayla leaned forward cautiously. "If this kills me," she said calmly, "I will be very disappointed." Thomas sat down across from her. "If it kills you," he said, "I will write a strongly worded complaint to the soup." She studied the bowl for a long moment before finally tasting it. Her expression remained unreadable. Thomas waited. "Well?" he asked. She swallowed slowly. "It is surprisingly good." Thomas leaned back proudly. "Of course it is. What did you add?" He scratched his head. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. Some mushrooms I found near the river." Shayla froze. "You fed me unidentified alien mushrooms." Thomas raised a finger. "In my defense, they smelled delicious." For several seconds, Shayla simply stared at him. Then she took another spoonful. "It is still good," she admitted. Thomas grinned. Outside, wind brushed softly through the trees. The peaceful silence lasted several minutes before Shayla spoke again. "You live very far from everyone." Thomas nodded. "That's the idea." "Do you never get lonely?" He shrugged. "I talk to machines." She sighed. That was not reassuring. Thomas gestured toward the window. "Besides," he said, "the universe is always out there. Plenty of company." Shayla followed his gaze. The sky above the mountains was clear again. Stars filled the darkness, distant and quiet. For a moment, she simply watched them. Then she said quietly, "Out there is not always peaceful." Thomas looked at her carefully. "You've seen a lot of war." She did not answer, but the silence confirmed it. Thomas picked up his spoon again. "Well," he said gently, "the mountains are very bad at war." Shayla glanced at him. "What does that mean?" "They refuse to move," he explained. "Terrible soldiers." She almost smiled. Then suddenly she sat up straight. Her eyes focused sharply on the sky beyond the window. Thomas noticed the change immediately. "What?" She stood slowly and walked toward the door. Thomas followed. The cold air rushed inside as she opened it. High above the mountains, several faint lights moved across the sky. They were distant, barely visible, but their motion was precise, scanning patterns. Shayla's expression hardened. Thomas squinted upward. Satellites? No. What then? She hesitated. Searchcraft. Thomas blinked. For you? She did not answer immediately, but her silence said enough. Thomas rubbed the back of his neck. Well, he said slowly, that explains the glowing armor. Shayla kept watching the lights moving across the sky. They will not stop searching, she said quietly. Thomas leaned against the doorframe. How long until they find you? She studied the scanning pattern carefully. Sooner than I hoped. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Shayla glanced at him. You do not seem alarmed. Thomas shrugged. I've had worse evenings. She stared at him. People are searching an entire planet for me. Thomas looked back up at the lights. Well, he said calmly, that seems inefficient. Shayla raised an eyebrow. How would you search for someone? Thomas pointed toward the forest behind the cabin. If I were hiding from the entire galaxy, he said, I would pick the quietest place possible. She looked at him. Yes, Thomas smiled slightly. Which means they will never expect you to be hiding with a man who cooks glowing soup. For the first time since spotting the ships, Shayla laughed again. But above them, the searchlights continued moving slowly across the sky, and each pass brought them closer to the mountains. The lights in the sky disappeared sometime after midnight, but neither of them slept very well. Thomas spent most of the night in a chair near the window, occasionally glancing up at the stars while pretending he was not keeping watch. Shayla sat across the room, cleaning the damaged pieces of her armor with quiet precision. The small repair nanofibers inside the plates flickered faintly, slowly sealing cracks and restoring the alloy surface. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken things. At one point, Thomas looked up from his coffee and said, You know, if those ships come down here, I'm going to need a better explanation than mysterious alien visitor. Shayla did not look up from the armor plate she was repairing. What explanation would you prefer? Thomas considered this carefully. Something simple, he said, like, this is my cousin visiting from another planet. That would not be believable. Thomas shrugged. Neither is glowing soup, yet here we are. Shayla paused for a moment, then continued working. By morning, the mountain air had grown calm again. A pale layer of mist drifted between the trees, while sunlight slowly climbed over the distant peaks. Thomas stepped outside carrying a mug of coffee. Shayla followed a few moments later. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Shayla's long ears tilted slightly as she listened. Thomas noticed. What is it? She scanned the sky again. Nothing yet, she said. Thomas nodded and took a sip of coffee. That's usually when trouble arrives, he replied. Shayla looked at him. You say that like it is experience. Oh, it is, Thomas said. Cargo stations were full of surprises. One time a smuggler hid an entire crate of illegal gravity grenades inside a shipment of fruit. She blinked. What happened? Thomas shrugged. The fruit exploded. She stared at him. That is not how fruit normally behaves. Thomas nodded. Exactly what we said. Shayla shook her head slowly, though the corner of her mouth lifted slightly. Thomas leaned against the railing of the cabin porch. So, he said, how big is the situation exactly? Shayla did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched the horizon carefully. Finally, she spoke. When I disappeared, she said quietly, entire fleets began searching. Thomas lowered his mug slowly. Fleets? Yes. How many fleets? She thought about it. Enough that several governments are probably arguing right now. Thomas stared at her. You are not just a soldier. No. You are not just a commander either. No. Thomas rubbed his face with one hand. I knew it, he said. Shayla looked at him curiously. Knew what? That this situation was too interesting to be normal. She folded her arms. You are not angry? Thomas shrugged. You crashed into my forest wearing military armor. I assumed there was a story. She studied him carefully. Most people would ask more questions. Thomas smiled. Oh, I have questions. She waited. Thomas raised a finger. But I've also learned something important about the universe. What? If someone falls out of space near your house, the explanation is usually complicated. Shayla almost laughed. At that exact moment, her expression changed. Her eyes focused sharply on the sky again. Thomas followed her gaze. At first, he saw nothing. Then a faint shimmer moved across the clouds. It was subtle, almost invisible, but Shayla recognized it immediately. Cloaked scout craft, she said quietly. Thomas squinted harder. I don't see anything. That is the point. The shimmer moved slowly across the sky, scanning the mountains. Thomas whistled softly. Well, he said, that looks expensive. Shayla turned toward the cabin. They are narrowing their search. Thomas set down his coffee. Meaning? They will send ground teams soon? Thomas thought about this for a moment. Then he nodded. All right. Shayla looked at him. You understand what that means? Yes. And, Thomas shrugged casually, I suppose I should clean the cabin. She blinked. That is your response. Well, he said, if heavily armed soldiers arrive, I'd prefer the place to look presentable. Shayla stared at him. You are remarkably calm. Thomas scratched his beard. To be fair, he said, I once repaired a plasma engine while it was still running. That is extremely dangerous. Yes, Thomas agreed, but it made great overtime pay. The faint shimmer above the clouds moved again. Closer now. Shayla's expression grew more serious. They will find me eventually. Thomas nodded slowly. Maybe. She looked at him. Maybe? Thomas leaned against the porch railing and gestured toward the mountains. You chose this place for a reason, didn't you? Shayla hesitated. Yes. Why? She looked out at the forest. For a moment, she said quietly. It felt peaceful. Thomas smiled faintly. Well, he said, that means you picked the right mountain. She studied him. And when they arrive, Thomas picked up his coffee again and took another sip. Then, he said calmly, we will have a very awkward conversation. The scout craft returned the following morning. This time it did not bother hiding. A sleek silver vessel drifted down through the clouds and hovered above the forest like a patient predator. Wind from its engines rippled through the treetops, sending snow sliding off the branches in quiet waves. Thomas stepped out onto the porch holding a mug of coffee. He looked up at the ship. Well, he said calmly, that escalated. Shayla stood beside him, already wearing the repaired sections of her armor. The metal plates shimmered faintly in the morning light, their internal systems humming quietly. Her posture had changed again. Not the relaxed presence she had developed during the last few days. This was the posture of a commander. The ship lowered slowly until it hovered above the clearing. A hatch opened underneath it, and a small transport platform descended. Several armored soldiers stepped out. Their armor was darker than Shayla's, heavier, designed for combat. They spread out cautiously as they approached the cabin. Thomas leaned slightly toward Shayla. I assume they're not here for the soup. No, she said quietly. The soldiers stopped a few meters away. Their leader stepped forward and removed his helmet. He looked directly at Shayla. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then the officer said, General. Thomas slowly lowered his coffee. Oh, he murmured. General. The soldiers immediately straightened. Shayla's expression remained calm. You found me, she said. The officer looked both relieved and uneasy. The entire fleet has been searching, he replied. Your disappearance has created complications. Thomas raised a hand. I can imagine. Everyone turned to look at him. The officer studied him briefly. Who are you? Thomas gestured toward the cabin. Homeowner, he said. The officer looked confused. You are aware that you have been harboring the most important military commander in the galaxy. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Yes, I'm starting to piece that together. The soldiers exchanged glances. Shayla looked at the officer again. Why are you here personally, Commander Varric? The officer hesitated. The council wants you to return. She said nothing. They say the war cannot continue without you. Thomas took a slow sip of coffee. That seems like a lot of pressure for one person. No one responded. Shayla stared at the distant mountains. For decades, she had answered every call to battle, every crisis. Every impossible mission. That had been her life. But something had changed during the quiet days in the cabin. She looked toward Thomas. He stood on the porch rail like someone watching a mildly interesting weather report. "You are not saying anything," she told him. Thomas shrugged. "Well," he said, "this seems like a personal decision." The officer stepped forward urgently. "General, the fleets are waiting." Thomas raised a finger. "I have a question." Everyone looked at him again. Thomas nodded toward Shayla. "How long has she been fighting?" The officer answered immediately. 32 years. Thomas whistled softly. "That's a long shift." Shayla crossed her arms. "Thomas." "What?" he said. "I'm just asking." He looked back at the officer. "And in those 32 years," Thomas continued, "has anyone asked her if she's tired?" The clearing fell silent. The officer hesitated. "That is not—" Thomas held up a hand. I know. Duty, responsibility, galactic stability." He gestured toward the mountains. "But sometimes the strongest soldier in the room is the one smart enough to take a break." The officer looked uncertain. Shayla studied Thomas carefully. "You are suggesting I abandon my command?" Thomas shook his head. "No." He pointed toward the sky. "I'm suggesting you remember that the galaxy has more than one hero." She looked at the soldiers waiting beside the ship, then back at the cabin. For the first time in years, the choice did not feel like a battlefield decision. It felt human. Shayla stepped forward. Commander Varric straightened immediately. "General, the fleet awaits your orders." She looked at him calmly. "My first order," she said, "is that the fleet learns how to operate without me." The soldiers exchanged stunned glances. Varric blinked. "General." "I will return," Shayla continued, "but not today." Thomas smiled slightly. "Good plan." She glanced at him. "Do not look so satisfied." "I'm not," Thomas said. "I'm just relieved you won't destroy my forest with a warship." The soldiers relaxed slightly. Commander Varric finally nodded. "If that is your decision, we will inform the council." The transport platform lifted them back toward the ship. Moments later, the vessel rose into the sky and disappeared into the clouds. The clearing became quiet again. Thomas stretched his arms. "Well," he said, "that was dramatic." Shayla stood beside him, watching the empty sky. "You changed something today," she said. Thomas shrugged. "Maybe." She looked at him. "For the first time in decades," she admitted quietly, "I did not feel like the galaxy was sitting on my shoulders." Thomas leaned against the porch rail. "That's because mountains are very good at holding weight." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Thomas looked toward the cabin. "So," he said casually, "celebratory soup?" Shayla sighed. "I believe that soup may violate several interstellar safety laws." Thomas grinned. "Only one way to find out." She followed him back toward the cabin, and for the first time in many years, the greatest warrior in the galaxy walked toward a peaceful day instead of a battlefield.